In 1692, the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts, became the stage for one of the darkest chapters in American history. A community that had once been tightly bound by faith and tradition unraveled before the world's eyes as fear, paranoia, and vengeance took hold. The Salem Witch Trials began with the accusations of a few young girls, but what followed was a hysteria that led to the deaths of 20 innocent people. While we know the names of those accused, Tituba, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, the truth of what happened to the families they left behind remains a shadow in the darkness. The Salem Witch Trials were not just a story of those who died in the gallows. They were about the families left to pick up the pieces. Spouses lost their partners, children were orphaned, and communities were torn apart. What became of those who were left behind? The children who witnessed their mothers' executions, the husbands who saw their wives accused of crimes they didn't commit. How did they rebuild their lives in the aftermath of this mass hysteria? This story is not just about the accused. It's about those who suffered in silence, the families whose lives were shattered in a frenzy of fear and vengeance. It's about the lasting impact of mass hysteria, how it leaves scars on the generations that follow. Today, we uncover the hidden victims of the Salem Witch Trials, the families who lost everything, yet were forced to carry on in the face of unimaginable grief. Hit that subscribe button, because the true cost of the Salem Witch Trials is a tale that will leave you questioning everything you know about justice and human resilience. The winter of 1692 was one of the harshest on record in Salem Village, and it wasn't just the cold that brought suffering to the community. A deadly combination of smallpox outbreaks, religious tension, and growing conflicts between traditional Puritans and the emerging merchant classes set the stage for what would become an explosive period of mass hysteria. It started innocently enough. Two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began to display strange symptoms, convulsing and claiming that they were being tormented by witches. Their accusations would ignite a wildfire of suspicion, one that spread quickly through the community. In a matter of months, the accusations spiraled out of control. What started as whispers of witchcraft turned into a full-blown panic, fueled by religious zeal, social rivalries, and fear of the devil's influence. By the spring of 1692, accusations were being made against neighbors, friends, and even relatives. Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft, and the trials were held in the court of Oyer and Termina in Salem town. 20 people would eventually be executed, 19 hanged, and 1 pressed to death. Several others would die in prison, awaiting their trial, and countless more would suffer the emotional and social devastation of being accused. We often remember the names of those accused, the ones who met their tragic end. But what about the families they left behind? For every name on the list of the executed, there were children who lost their parents, spouses who lost their partners, and communities that lost their trust in each other. The ripple effects of the trials extended far beyond the hangman's noose. It's easy to focus on the accused, but the true cost of the Salem Witch Trials lies in the stories of those who were left to pick up the pieces to rebuild their lives in the wake of unfathomable loss. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old respected church member, was one of the most tragic figures in the trials. Despite a petition signed by 39 neighbors in her defense, Rebecca was hanged on July 19, 1692. Her family, particularly her husband, Francis Nurse, and their 8 children, were left to cope with the aftermath of her death. The nurses faced social ostracism, as their name became synonymous with witchcraft in the eyes of the community. Francis, devastated by the loss of his wife, struggled to maintain their farm and provide for their children. Their once thriving farm was sold to cover debts and legal fees, and the family's reputation was forever tarnished. Rebecca's daughter, Sarah Nurse Cloyce, was also accused of witchcraft, but she was released after enduring a long period of imprisonment. In a letter written years later, Sarah lamented, Our name is blackened. Our fields lie fallow. The pain of losing a mother, the trauma of being accused, and the financial ruin left the nurse family in a state of despair that would last for generations. The emotional scars, however, were far deeper than the financial toll. The nurses were branded with a stigma that would follow them for the rest of their lives, making it impossible for them to rebuild their reputation or their lives. Sarah Good, a homeless mother, was another tragic figure whose fate was sealed in the frenzy of accusation. Sarah was hanged on the same day as Rebecca Nurse, leaving behind a husband, William Good, and two daughters, Dorothy, who was only 4 years old, and an infant. Dorothy, despite her age, was interrogated and jailed in the aftermath of her mother's execution. The psychological toll of being imprisoned and accused of witchcraft would haunt Dorothy for the rest of her life. In a petition filed in 1710, William Good described the trauma his daughter endured, stating, "My child is broken in spirit." The Good family's property was seized, leaving them destitute, and they were left to fend for themselves in a world that had turned its back on them. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials didn't just affect the accused, it wreaked havoc on the families who were left behind. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old man who was pressed to death for refusing to plead, left behind his wife, Martha Corey, who was hanged just days after his death. Their 5 children were left with the burden of inherited debt, the stigma of witchcraft, and the emotional trauma of losing both parents in such brutal fashion. Court records from 1693 show that their daughter, Deliverance, pleaded for her parents' estate, but her request was denied due to the witchcraft taint attached to their name. And then there's the case of John Proctor, who was hanged on August 19, 1692. John left behind his pregnant wife, Elizabeth, and 7 children. Elizabeth was also accused, but spared execution because she was pregnant. However, the Proctor family's world was shattered. Elizabeth lost their farm, and their children were left to navigate a world that shunned them. In a diary written by their son, William Proctor, in 1709, he wrote, "We are shunned as cursed." The Proctor family's story is a testament to the unrelenting pain and ostracism that followed the executions, even years after the trials had ended. The emotional toll on the families was immeasurable. These were not just stories of loss. They were stories of families torn apart, of lives destroyed, and of a community that had been shattered by fear and hysteria. The aftermath of the Salem Witch Trials left a scar on the lives of the families who had to carry on in the face of public condemnation and personal grief. This was the hidden story of Salem, the untold tragedy of the families who were left behind, the ones who never got the justice they deserved, and the ones whose lives would never be the same. The devastation brought by the Salem Witch Trials didn't simply disappear once the hysteria ebbed. It lingered in the shadows of the community for generations, in the lives of the children and spouses left behind, and in the lingering stigma that clung to the names of the accused. While the trials ended, the trauma was far from over. For those who survived the aftermath, the true cost of the trials was a legacy of shame, isolation, and financial ruin. The scars of the trials would never heal for these families. They would become generational wounds that shaped their futures and their sense of self. The emotional impact on the children of the accused was immeasurable. Take Dorothy Good, for example. At just 4 years old, she was incarcerated and interrogated during the height of the trials. Her mother, Sarah Good, was hanged on July 19, 1692, leaving Dorothy alone in a world that saw her as nothing more than a child of a witch. After her mother's execution, Dorothy was subjected to the cruelest treatment, as if she were guilty by association. William Good, her father, wrote a poignant petition in 1710 in which he described the irreparable damage to his daughter's spirit. "My child is broken in spirit." Dorothy, Like many other children who witnessed their parents' deaths or were orphaned during the trials, carried the psychological burden for the rest of her life. The stigma attached to her name, being the daughter of a so-called witch, haunted her. She was socially ostracized, faced difficulties finding work, and struggled to marry. Her life became a reflection of how deeply the trials affected not only the accused, but also their families, particularly the youngest victims who were left to bear the consequences of crimes they didn't commit. The emotional scars didn't just affect the children, they affected the very fabric of these families' ability to rebuild. For Francis Nurse, the husband of Rebecca Nurse, life after the execution of his wife was a journey into despair. Rebecca, a beloved member of the community, was hanged despite a petition from 39 neighbors attesting to her good character. After her death, Francis and their 8 children were left to pick up the pieces, but their struggles were compounded by social ostracism. Their farm was sold off to cover legal debts and creditors, and the family's name was forever tainted. Rebecca's daughter, Sarah Nurse Cloyce, who had also been accused, but eventually released, reflected years later on the toll her family endured. "Our name is blackened, our fields lie fallow." This statement encapsulated the devastation faced by the Nurse family. Not only did they lose a mother and a wife, but their financial security was shattered, their land taken away, and their social standing reduced to nothing. While some of the nurses were eventually able to regain some of their property, the emotional and societal costs were far more difficult to recover from. The financial ruin these families experienced cannot be overstated. The legal fees, the loss of property, and the social stigma attached to the name of an accused witch often left families destitute. The Proctor family, for instance, was another tragic example. John Proctor, hanged in August 1692, left behind his pregnant wife Elizabeth and 7 children. While Elizabeth was spared due to her pregnancy, she lost their farm and was left to raise their children in a world that no longer welcomed her. Elizabeth Proctor's grief was compounded by the weight of being accused herself. The stigma attached to her family, marked as witchkin, forever changed the way their children were treated. William Proctor, John's son, wrote in 1709, "We are shunned as cursed." This reflects not just the immediate trauma of losing a father, but the long-term isolation and poverty faced by children who were branded by association. The Proctors, like the Nurses and Goods, were left to deal with the aftermath of a public execution, the destruction of their property, and the emotional toll of being shunned by their community. For families like the Coreys, the devastation was even more pronounced. Giles Corey, aged 81, was pressed to death for refusing to plead guilty or innocent, a cruel and slow form of execution that was intended to force a confession. His wife, Martha, was hanged just 3 days later. Their 5 children, including daughter Deliverance, were left to deal with the aftermath. Court records from 1693 reveal that Deliverance Corey pleaded for her parents' estate, but her request was denied due to the witchcraft taint attached to her name. The children of the Coreys were not just orphaned. They were financially ruined, socially ostracized, and emotionally scarred by the brutal deaths of their parents. Deliverance's plea for her inheritance was a tragic reminder that the families of the accused were never truly given justice. The Coreys, like many others, were left with nothing. No support from their community, no opportunity to reclaim their lost livelihoods, and no way to erase the stain of witchcraft that would follow them for generations. The emotional trauma suffered by these families didn't fade with time. In fact, it continued to haunt their descendants for years. The legacy of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't just one of physical loss. It was one of generational trauma. Descendants of the accused were often looked upon with suspicion, their names forever tainted by the events of 1692. The great-grandchildren of Rebecca Nurse, for instance, continued to face the shadow of the trials well into the 18th century. A 1750 diary entry from Sarah Nurse's descendant reads, "Our name carries a shadow." Even after generations, the weight of those accusations, false as they were, remained a heavy burden to bear. Despite the injustice, some families did find ways to rebuild. In 1711, Massachusetts offered restitution to some of the families affected by the trials, but the compensation was woefully insufficient. 22 families, including the nurses, received a total of $578, but many, like the Goods, received nothing more than a fraction of what they had lost. The nurses were able to regain some of their property by 1720, but the stigma never fully lifted. They, like the Proctors and the Coreys, lived in a world that could not easily forgive or forget the events of 1692. The emotional wounds, however, were far harder to heal than any financial restitution could cure. These families carried the trauma of betrayal, loss, and public shame for generations. Many sought to escape the stigma by relocating to other areas, some moving to Maine, where they hoped to build new lives free from the shadow of the trials. But even in these new communities, the specter of Salem followed them. Fear of betrayal, distrust of authority, and the psychological scars of being falsely accused shaped their worldview and their relationships for years to come. The impact of the Salem Witch Trials goes beyond the historical spectacle of the executions. It's a story of real human suffering, of families torn apart by mass hysteria and false accusations. These were not just stories of people who died. They were stories of children who lost their parents, spouses who lost their partners, and communities that lost their sense of trust and humanity. The families who lived through this tragedy did not simply mourn the loss of their loved ones. They mourned the loss of their reputations, their social status, and their ability to rebuild their lives. As we reflect on the legacy of the Salem Witch Trials, we must remember the unseen victims, the families whose lives were irreparably damaged by a flawed and unjust system. Their stories are a sobering reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, of the power of fear to destroy lives, and of the importance of seeking justice, not just for the accused, but for all those affected by the aftermath.